like the song.
Well, that music means it's time for another episode of Just Can't Not. I'm your host, Chris Lindstrom, and this is part of our preview for the Pittsburgh Fringe Festival. I know this is outside of our typical Rochester and surrounding area content, but the Fringe is universal, and we're thrilled to partner with the Pittsburgh team for their 13th year, running from March 19th to the 28th. To learn more about all the shows and get tickets, go to pittsburghfringe.org. Tickets cap out at $20 per show, and an entire event pass is only $150. So make sure to get your tickets today and join the action over on Penn Ave. And I'm here with a guest. Guest, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Noam Osband, and I am a artist and theater performer who lives in Philadelphia, albeit one with deep family roots in Rochester.
That's awesome. I'm excited to bounce around on that a little bit. And Gnome's doing a show called Circumscribed, a true tall tale of one father, two sons, and thousands of foreskins. Emphasis on my side. And then the show's being held over at the Bloomfield Garfield Activity Center on March 20th and the 21st, both at 6:35 p.m. TBS Standard Time. $15 tickets over at pittsburghfringe.org. So I mean, the title is evocative in of itself, but tell me about the broad sheets on the show, and then we'll start bouncing around.
Sure. So it's a show about family and fatherhood and those relationships and what it is to become an adult and become a different person than perhaps a beloved parent might have thought. And it's through the prism of my own father. His name was Michael Osband, born in Rochester in 1949, and he went to Monroe High, played tennis there. It's so cool. You're from Rochester, and he was a Moel, a Jewish ritual circumcist, and he was a pediatrician. And then when my mom was pregnant with their first kid, he was a very spiritual and religious man, and he wanted to do the circumcision himself. So he, at the time, was doing his residency in pediatrics in the Bronx, and he volunteered to do all of the circumcisions in the hospital, and that's how we learned. Jokes on him, because that was the only one of their four children who was a girl. But then the others were boys, and he circumcised me and my siblings and friend kids and family kids, and we used to bury foreskins by the sassafras tree near the garage. And so it's a story both about my relationship with him and having this father who was this real, not perfect, but really wonderful father, but also this like larger than life character who would tell these stories that had like a sort of fantastical tale element to them, that I actually think he probably believed a lot of them. And about sort of having him as a dad. And then he passed when I was 20, so fairly young. He was 51. And in the years after, looking for father figures and making choices that were maybe not ideal, and then becoming a father myself at age 40 and wrestling with the topic of circumcision for my own son. So, and I'll say, circumcision is sort of a through line, but it's not. I wouldn't say that's exactly what the show's about. It's very catchy. You notice the title, and most shows don't have foreskins in the title, and it's legit, and all. But I'd say it's broader, sort of like an examination of just sort of family relationships and all, and it's told with a lot of. There's a projector, and I show a lot of photos and videos and letters, like a note I got in ninth grade from my science teacher, who gave me a 90 instead of a 92 because I was too disruptive, and a lot of sort of fun gems like that.
Well, I mean, and I love that description of, there's so many different subsets of dads when you think about them, right? There's the serious dad, there's the business dad who's never around, and you know what? There's the character dad. It's the character dad, the weird dad, the guy that's got a system for everything. But the way you're describing it, like, you had a character dad, like somebody who was, might have had a lot of big ideas, and all those other things. There's something. Everyone is special in their own right, but it's a certain lane growing up that way with that kind of person.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think, I've never heard of like that typology before, but I think you're absolutely right. Like I grew up in this very insular Orthodox Jewish community, right outside of Boston in Brookline. even though I grew up like within walking distance of Fenway Park, I didn't really have any serious like non-Jewish friends or acquaintances till college. And but within that sort of tight knit community, he was a very well known and sort of big character. And I think in part because on the one hand, he was a very respected physician, and he was a pediatric hematologist oncologist, so kids with blood cancers, and would work with like the most intense, craziest thing maybe that exists.
Of course.
And was a teacher of Torah, and like really served the community. He was like on the board of the Jewish Day School, and he was part of the Chevra Kadisha, which is the group that takes care of bodies after they die in accordance with Jewish tradition. But he also had this part of him which was a complete clown and
Yeah.
humorist, and um, he could get away with being outrageous because he was also a very respected man, So like he could get away with every Saturday afternoon after services in the synagogue, there's a meal that's eaten called Shalosh Shudas. It's like the third meal of Sabbath. And he would every week, the meal would end, and he would open the doors to the synagogue, to the auditorium, and he would loudly scream, "Feeding time." And when people would say to him, like, "Michael, why do you say that?" He'd say, "Oh, because that's what they say in the zoo when it's time to feed the animals." And I think if he hadn't been also this like serious person who was a real upstanding, contributing member of society,
Yeah.
um, that wouldn't have played as well, But he was, so it did. And he would be the auctioneer at the school auction, and it was
Yep.
one of my favorite nights of the year because it was basically watching my dad do stand up for 3 hours,
It's
and he
exactly
had
the way you described him too, is like you're talking about somebody who had that who was a serious person in many ways, but had that innate showmanship
oh
of
yeah,
wanting to do the bit all the
yeah,
time,
uh
but
huh,
was stuck in the fact that he, like, was stuck in, like, in an Orthodox community, not stuck, but, like, who lived in an
yeah,
Orthodox community, who was, like, a respected pediatric,
uh huh.
like, cancer doctor, and then, like, just wants to do bits. He just wants to do bits.
That's very true. My sister, I remember in the eulogy she gave for him, said something like, at any like bar mitzvah or like big, bat mitzvah or a big event, you would want to be at the table with him, which is
Yeah.
true because he was such a funny person. I have such good memories of him just like making everybody laugh at our Sabbath table or when we had guests. And this comes up in the show that like part of what inspired the show and part of what the show is about is like um when we talk about him and we celebrate him in my family, the things that we celebrate are the more serious elements. That
Yeah.
he was a real teacher of Torah, that he was this physician, he was a real committed Zionist at a time when I think it was maybe a little bit less complicated than it is now. Although, to be fair, if he was alive now, I think, like most of my family, he still would be. The show doesn't really get into politics at all or that. But like,
I think
this is all to
realistically,
say,
those things were always complicated, it just had the veneer of not being complicated.
100%.
At the time. It
Yeah,
was always complicated, but
yeah,
that's so many things in life where and it's just a weird analogy. I was like when I was on a work trip, somebody had I'm a big coffee person amongst many food and beverage things, but somebody brought it up and I told them like, here, all these things about coffee and geopolitical and you know economic drivers of different communities and third world countries. It's like, oh, well, it didn't used to be that complicated. I'm like, no, no, it's always complicated.
yeah,
We just
yeah.
didn't know much about it. It was always that way.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
but
true.
that's
That's very fair. But the point I was going to make is those are all true, and that's what we usually get talked about when we like celebrate the day of his death each year. But
yeah,
the parts that left the biggest impression on me were this like sense of absurdity and storytelling and being a funny person, and he loved crossing the line in a way that didn't usually make people uncomfortable. Like I remember him being at the table telling like jokes about the Holocaust as a Jew with a real sense of humor,
yeah,
and that's the part of him that really rubbed off on me. And I should say like. It, I don't think those things are, while they might not be serious, I think those things are really weighty and important. Like I do a lot of street performing. I improvise songs, in parks, and I'm at the Eagles games in Philly every week in the lots. And I give out a card that says Noam Osband Troubadour for hire, and on the back of it it says because silliness is serious business, and I
Yeah,
firmly believe that. And
100% agree.
that's the part of him that left the deepest impression on me. And I think that's in part what the show is about, is like that I chose sort of not to be religious, and personally do not believe in God and do not practice Judaism with it all the sort of rigor and strictures he did. And uh, but I still feel really connected to him in part because of these other elements that were so impactful, informative for me. And like I'm a performer, and there's a part of me that's a ham, and there's nothing better than being in front of a room and making the room all laugh. And um, this show doesn't do. I have other shows that are like a bit more where like they play with people, making people like uncomfortable. Like this show doesn't
Yeah.
really do that. In a few bits, like there's a moment where you get to watch the video cassette of my 1980 circumcision. Um, but but on the whole, I don't. But it's like that. That's what really resonated with me, and it's fun to tell his story in my own terms.
Well, and I think there's also like not everybody is like, I'd say has spent time around the, Jewish communities, Orthodox and otherwise. When you mention all those different aspects, to me that seems like a very logical statement where there's seriousness, but amongst a lot of the seriousness, depending on scale, of course, because you can be ultra serious. Um, but a lot of it, there's a lot of seriousness, but there's also a lot of debate, and there's a lot of like, oh, how do we interpret this? And
Sure,
it's never perfectly clear because each rabbi from a different place might interpret something differently.
sure,
And there's all the different aspects of it where that debate of all the little things, and it never stops. It's never like hard codified. Some things are, of course, but a lot of things are debated continuously forever. And that constant like, oh, I want to defend my point, I want to be involved with this, how do you understand this? Like there's always that constant wanting to learn more, and yes, be respectful, but always like being modern too in many ways. Maybe not all of the orthodox, but
yeah,
a lot of parts of the culture continue to evolve as time goes on.
yeah. No, and I'll say the specific subset that I grew up in. The term that gets used is modern Orthodox.
Mm,
Maybe that describes like congregation Beth Shalom that
okay.
my father's parents used to go there until my grandfather, who was a lovely grandfather but a real curmudgeon, had a falling out with the rabbi. That was probably, I'm sure, his fault, like my grandfather's fault. And then he insisted for the rest of his life he would not call him Rabbi Kalimnik. He insisted on calling him Mister Kalimnik.
Oh,
Okay,
oh,
Zeta.
oh,
But
oh, for a serious man, though. Oh boy, those that small
oh
change.
yeah, he was very
Oh, there's
adamant
a
on
lot
that.
of weight in that.
And but anyways, it's a community that prides itself on engagement within some limits with the secular community and secular knowledge, and it is not opposed to the modern world in the way that what typifies, let's say, ultra Orthodox Jews. Um,
Yeah.
so you are absolutely right that there was that sort of both real sense of tradition, but also real engagement with the world.
Yeah. So what I kind of want to pivot over to is, so when you started developing this, where did that, I mean, obviously, part of that showman heritage of your
Yeah.
of your family, but where did your path lead you to start creating shows and being involved in this side of things? Where did your path go from, learning about yourself and then getting where you are now?
Sure. So I used to do performing as a kid. Like I went to a small Jewish school that didn't have a lot of theater, but I there was like a play a year. I would do it. Senior year, I was like the director of it, and that was cool. And in college, I did a lot of musical theater. But I sometimes think about like where I sort of like my baptism as a performer was I got a master's in English at this place called the Breadlow School of English, which is it's a summer program. I spent 5 summers in Vermont. It's connected to Middlebury College, but you're outside of Middlebury, like sort of. It's like a campus in the woods. It's amazing. You're in the middle of
Well,
nowhere.
you don't want to be in the metropolis of Middlebury. You need to get out into the real, yeah.
And what's used to be amazing is when my first summer there, when the story I'll tell you happened, was 2006. So this was before they had there was no Wi-Fi on campus, and there was no cell service on campus,
Of
and there was
course.
a payphone, and it was really awesome. Like I remember when they put Wi-Fi on campus, I actually like approached the director and was like, I think we shouldn't have this, and I actually still believe that. Like it was cooler when because then anyways, everything that makes the modern world worse. So I'm there that summer, and it's a master's in English lit, and I took a class in romantic poetry. I've always liked poetry. I have 4 tattoos. They're all lines of poetry. I'm a poetry guy. And I took this romantic poetry class with this really good teacher called Isabel Armstrong, who is just like a older English woman. And there was a talent show one weekend, and I wrote a few songs, and one of them was I just thought, oh, it's kind of funny, the idea of a romantic song about a romantic poetry teacher. I did not actually have a crush on her. I was just like, well, that's a cute idea for a song. And I asked her, I was like, do you mind if I sing this song? And she was just, I think, slightly bemused and was like, I guess, sure. So I did. And I thought it was like kind of cute, whatever. The response to it was like rapture. I mean, just people like loved it. It got a standing O that night. I had all these people coming up to me who were like, "Oh, I heard you do this song. Can you sing it for me?" And it was super inspiring and life changing. And I was like, "Oh, I
Mm.
guess I actually have a talent of some sort for writing songs." And so I started doing street performing. So I actually was a street performer for a decade before I did Fringe shows, and I do a lot of improvising songs on the spot. That's like my troubadour thing. That following fall, I was living in Philly, and I'd be playing at all these Eagles games. I actually got they played a bit of me on Inside the NFL on HBO. I wrote a very good song about Terrell Owens, who was
I
hated by
mean,
the Eagles.
what an opportunist. What a great topic to write songs about.
So it was the year after he had gone to Dallas, so everybody hated him. I'll just sing you a snippet of the chorus. Poor Terrell Owens, where are you going? I think you're going to hell for the lies that you spread and the things that you said. I hate you more than I can tell. It was a crazy song, and people loved it, and I was like, cool, there's a there. So I used to do a lot of street performing, and then starting in my 30s, I moved to New York. I was working on a PhD in anthropology, which I did finish. I'm a doctor of anthropology, which doesn't come up too much from performing, but it's true. And I was living in New York when I was wrapping up, and I just started performing more and more at sort of open mics and that stuff, and was doing musical comedy, and was enjoying it. And it's sort of, in some ways, my biggest passion. And then in 2017, I was the summer after I finished, I did a dissertation about tree planters in America and Canada, a whole other topic, which is really not much to do with performance. But that summer, I was planting trees in northern Ontario, and one evening
As
I
you
was
do.
by myself, as one does, and I was
Yeah.
by myself biking around, and I said, I want to do a show at the Edinburgh Fringe, having never done any Fringe festivals or anything like that before. Starting with a very ambitious goal of the world's largest Fringe festival,
Yeah.
and it was rewarding. I did that next summer. I brought my first show. I ended up doing shows 2 years in a row there that were very similar. One was called Wikipedia Love. The other was A Night of Wikipedia Love. And they were songs about sex and death based on Wikipedia articles about
Great.
Homo sapiens and other deeply tragic animals. Um,
Super.
and it was very fun. I had like a projector with me, and I would show all these slides and silly things, and really fun. And then the next thing that I did for a show was I did 4 different iterations of a show that I still do in a lot of places called Brother Loves Good Time Gospel Hour, which is a satirical, shady televangelist. It's a very fun show. There's never any winking. It's like Brother Love is this it doesn't mock religion. What it does is mock shady televangelists who are a category worthy of mocking. And he both is constantly raising for money for things like his two Learjets or his four alimonies, but he also has very twisted theology. I'll just give you song titles and you'll get an idea of what the show is like. Hippie
Mhm.
headed hot bod Jesus. That's a song about how Christ Jesus is, there's no God quite as sexy as him. And I do it with like a Southern twang. I spend a lot of time in Arkansas, and I like co-created the character with a dear friend and the namesake of my child who like grew up a hillbilly Baptist in like the foothills of the Ozarks, which also like played a role in creating the character. And anyway, song titles are Hippie Headed Hot Bod Jesus, Cocaine for Christ, Let the Good Lord Fill Your Spiritual Hole.
Great.
So you get the idea. Very fun, a show I plan on doing for the rest of my life in different times, but is both those shows are completely different and have no element of earnestness.
Well, I think my first thought was like, oh, is this was this a takeoff of the Bruce Pritchard character from the early '90s of the WWE? So no, not in this case.
No,
Uh,
no, but I would say Brother Love is a very wrestling type character because there's no winking to the audience. So at no point do I ever indicate I recognize that what I'm singing is insane. And when I'm
sure.
asking people to confess their sins and talk about which kind of dog are they attracted to, because we've all had to deal with those temptations. There's never any winking. Um, but then I should say, I decided to create then this show, which is my Circumscribed, which is my first storytelling show. Because I just was like, I have all these like amazing stories about my dad that I used to tell around the table and whatever. And I should also say, I started performing in my 30s at this thing called Mortified, which is both a live event and a podcast. An
Okay.
amazing event. I don't think they have it in Rochester. They do have it all around the country
Terrific.
in some larger cities. And what it is you read your childhood journals and writings and whatever.
Great.
And so you're reading stuff that is usually horrible and very embarrassing. And so I would often read like this like juvenile poetry I wrote when I was a teenager that's like full of romantic angst and is very dirty and often has this like weird relationship to God and religion, um, because of where I was in life and time. And I would read in the show this letter that my dad sent me that I actually do in Circumscribed. It's a letter that I forgot about and then I rediscovered in my mom's attic in my late 20s in a box. So I had saved it years ago because I clearly was like, well, this one's a keeper. It's a letter he sent when I was in eighth grade. I went through this stage in middle school where I used to talk about devil worship a lot. Not because I actually worshiped the devil, I didn't believe in it and all, but I, partly inspired by my dad, I think a little bit nature and a little bit nurture, because my son is very like this. I just love sticking a toe over the line. And
Yeah.
and in Jewish tradition, like some of the biggest sins are things like murder, which I wasn't going to do, illicit sexual relations. Oh my God, I would have loved to have done that as a teenager. Uh, but idolatry is one of them. And it's like, well, I can have fun messing around with this. So I had a few years where I used to talk about worshiping the devil a lot because I thought it was really funny. And I remember being at camp and we had this like event concentric circles with the girls' campus. And it was like one gender was in a circle in the middle and one was on the outside. And you would take turns rotating. And it was like an icebreaker, get to know people. And I basically talked about worshiping the devil with everybody. And I remember by the end of the evening, there was like a group of boys following me as I would be go because I was just doing stand up basically. It was just like performing. And anyways, so it's that summer, I got a letter from my dad where he talks about this is a letter two of two. So it's actually a companion letter to a separate letter that he and his mom have written, where word has gotten back to them that I've been talking about worshiping Satan and that I also had this incident where I skinny dipped at camp and then like walked naked from my around like the boys waterfront, and that the head of the boys waterfront got fired because of it, which to be fair, all of which was true. And and you shouldn't be doing that. And it's this letter that would always kill at Mortified because it's a letter that is both very emotionally open in a way fathers are usually not, and very sincere and very warm, but also real shame based parenting that's like horrible parenting. So, like,
Yeah.
it's things like, Noam, you've been blessed with extraordinary gifts. Your sense of humor, intelligence, and curiosity are unusual. Major responsibility that Mama and I have in life is to help you fashion those gifts into a pattern of behavior that is characterized by kindness, compassion, and sensitivity. Quite obviously, we are failing at that task. Far more importantly, though, you are failing as well. So it's just this like
Oh,
letter that's like both very florid and sweet, but also laugh out loud funny. It's very funny, and so I would perform it at Mortified, and it would absolutely kill.
yeah.
I was like,
Well, there's nothing that kind of seriousness
yeah,
is like that it verges into the absurd, especially in context of you as an adult.
oh
I
yeah,
mean, that seriousness, earnestness can be one of the best things ever, right? It's that real positivity, like real honest positivity can be great. Like that letter sounds just like so earnest and honest, but out of context, that is just one of the funniest things you can possibly read.
oh 300%. It's it's
Yeah.
it's like such a beloved document to me now. And and I'll say one other thing, like two other things that sort of inspired my idea of doing the show. Well, I'll say three other things. One is also I now have gone to a lot of fringes, and I like storytelling as an art form. I would see people do it, and I really like it. And I like to tell stories. Like
You're
I
well suited to it, obviously.
yeah, like I enjoy when hosting a meal, telling a good story and adding detail, and there's certain things I do inspired by friends of mine, and I don't think I'm the world's best storyteller, but I don't think I'm the worst. Um, but beyond that, I also discovered in my late 20s or early 30s this picture that I never knew existed. And it's this picture which I love, and it's of my dad where it looks like a Renaissance painting. I use it in the show because like the lighting is perfectly cast on his face, and he's dressed in religious garb. So a tallis and tefillin, which is like the shawl that you wear, the fringe garment, and tefillin are these leather boxes with straps, and he's doing a circumcision. And then so when I first saw it, I was like, this is such a beautiful photo because my father was a really intense spiritual man. And although I'm not, I feel really lucky that my father exposed me to a lot of cool religious stuff as a kid. Like we would go to Israel for holidays, and there's this one holiday, Hoshana Rabbah, where people go to pray at dawn at the Western Wall. And there's this one prayer that when you get to um, the moment, which is when the first crack of Allah Shachar, when the first crack of light comes out, you're supposed to say like the most important prayer, the Shemona Esrei, and it's a silent prayer. And so there's this amazing thing, which is tens of thousands of people go, and it gets loud. And then when that second happens, everybody is quiet, praying silently, and you hear the
Mhm.
birds, and it's amazing. Or he would take us to like ultra orthodox, like a tish, a singing gathering, which was like not our thing, but my cousins would know where it was going on. So he exposed me to really cool stuff. And I'll say, one day I'm going to do a show about this. I have this very interesting relationship with like Jesus, where like I used to go to when I taught high school in Arkansas, I'd be going to like Black Pentecostal churches by myself a lot. I lived in the Mississippi Delta, and I played in a church band, in a Catholic church band in Brooklyn for a few years. I'm almost done with an album of songs that are like legit religious songs with like me and this nun maid. And I love it's, even though I personally am not a believer at all, I am very comfortable in religious spaces and actually really love the sense of wonder that they can invoke.
Mm.
And so I love this picture because it's just with my dad with this like gaze in the distance looking like an Old Testament prophet. And then I realized in looking at the back of the photo, it's me that has circumcised.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and so now it's the picture I keep above my desk. It's just my absolute favorite photo of my dad.
Yeah.
So that also played, I think, a role in things. And then and that when I perform in Mortified, I use that picture, and it's really lovely. Before I'd be doing this show, I'd be performing at Mortified about him, and I loved my dad, and he died sadly too young. And so to me, like when I would perform with his this large picture above me of the two of us and reading his letter, fundamentally it's about entertaining the crowd and its performance. It's not about my own personal like psychodrama and catharsis, but deeply rewarding. And then the last thing is I became a father at age 40, and a lot of the things that I do as a parent are inspired by him. He was a really great dad, and I love wrestling with my kids, being silly with my kids, tickling my kids, giving them a sense of wonder in the world. When I do this thing sometimes where I'm outside with my kids and we're not in gritty Philly, but we're in the forest. I do something sometimes with my kids where we just like close our eyes and we listen for a minute. And now sometimes my son does that to me. So sometimes we're outside and my son's like, okay, we're going to close our eyes and be quiet. And that's not something that my dad did with me, but that's like completely because of the dad I had. I think if I had had a different dad, that wouldn't have been my tip. And so then I think about my dad all the time. But more importantly, I guess vis-a-vis a show, it's like, well, now there's a certain now I could see how there was a show to do. Now it's like, oh, there's a through line. It becomes about relationships. It becomes about fatherhood. It becomes about creating a relationship with your dad when he dies young. And by the time he died, I never told him I was starting to not be religious, because that would have been a hard conversation. And he got at the end got really sick very quickly, and he had cancer, was in the hospital for 3 weeks, and I really wanted to, but I also was like, I don't want to distress a sick man at this point.
Yeah.
um, and uh, and also, it's so important for me to have my kids have a relationship with him. Not even so much for like their own sake. Like when they get older, maybe they'll care about him, maybe they won't. I don't know. Probably not too much because he's a man they'll never meet and all. But like, it's
Right.
important for me, for my own needs, to do that. And so then it just felt like, okay, there's the material for a show. So I started writing it. I performed it for the first time 12 months ago at a Fringe festival in Fresno, California.
Okay.
I started writing it maybe 16 months ago. And what I did was I have this, I'm seeing if it's on the table. It's not on the table. I have the Alpha Smart 2 is a word processor from the aughts or the early teens, which it is the most bare bones tech that has now become pop. You can't connect to the internet. You can't do anything than like
Right.
just write simple text, so you don't get distracted. And I started writing out like, what are stories that are funny of his? What are the stories that I tell friends? What are or like what are stories that I thought were funny? Like the time when I was 19 and I gave blood, and I got a letter from the Red Cross that my blood had tested positive, then negative, then inconclusive for syphilis. So hey, get yourself tested. But I was a virgin, so I wasn't too worried. I would have loved to have been exposed to syphilis, but there I am telling my parents like, "Hey guys, I need a syphilis test, even though I promise you I'm a virgin." And I tell a longer version of the story, and then
Yeah.
I end up going to the hospital that my dad worked at. I needed a physical before college, and everybody at the hospital. My dad didn't take off his yarmulke at work. Some parents in our community did that. My dad didn't. Everybody knew he was a very religious man, and my dad had to like ask one of the nurses to give me a physical, and then he has to say to her afterwards when everybody leaves the room, like, by the way, Cassie, Noam's a good Jewish boy. We're really excited for him to start college, but also you got to give him a syphilis test. And So just like stories like that. And then I had like all this material, and then I started fashioning it, and I was like, how do I make this a cohesive story with through lines and callbacks and lines that pay off later, and
And also
phrases that you'll
building that,
hear.
yeah, and building that up and down, right? Like if you're just telling the big stories, like that's cool. Like that's like the columns from somebody who are just, oh, column, column, column. Now it's a book.
Yeah.
Um, but a complete thought. is that's the work,
Yeah.
is to take all of those things and distill it into something that has, laugh moments and then the serious moments
Yeah.
and the emotional moments, right? Because if it's just comedy, just comedy's amazing. Like, I love just comedy. Um, but when there's a complete thought, especially with something that's loaded, right? That has your history, that has your
Yeah.
hey, you have the emotions in there from a 20-year-old that lost their father. Um, like, you didn't get to see him soften with age. You didn't get to see some of that stuff. My wife had something happen at a similar age. Like, we don't have connection with like a lot of her family.
Yeah.
That's a hard thing to reckon with. And like, I didn't know her then.
Yeah.
Like, and like nobody else can know that version of you before, because
100%.
that affects you. But
Yeah.
I love that you brought up that specific term, which is, although I don't necessarily, go about it the same way, that you respect people that maintain wonder, that maintain that, passion and community, right? Like, all the things you're describing is like identifying real community in the way that people find it. And
Yeah.
religion's one of those ways that people find that real community that for them enriches their lives.
Yeah.
I agree with you. For me, that's not that place.
Yeah.
I love that you found moments of that still, though, through that, and
Yeah.
that worked for you, even though it wasn't about the religion. The community can still be vibrant. It can still be a cool thing when you're working through all of these thoughts, right? You're working through all of these big ideas. How is that process of filtering it all through? Like, filtering it through, like, the knowledge of, somebody in their 40s
Yeah.
to look back at that version of you and bring some of that, like, naivete of somebody who's 20 who thinks they know so much,
Yeah.
and bringing some like, how do you look back at that, and, like, how do you grab some of that for the show?
Yeah. I mean, part of it's through stories. So, like, part of these stories are like these father figures I had. There's a lot of like, you hear me just being really stupid in my 20s. Like one of them, some of these are stories that seem larger than life. Like, one of these is, and I'll say as a side point, I, uh, a part of me that I actually like don't like, but I have resigned myself to it's like this, is I am very literal minded. I can't ever date anybody, or my spouse is not like this, and nobody I ever dated did it go well with, who is very sarcastic
Mhm.
because I don't pick up on it well. I truly, I'm not joking. I truly have a memory of being in fourth grade and hearing somebody say they took sarcastic out of the dictionary and looking it up in the dictionary and being like, I don't get it. It's in the dictionary. And I do really poorly with that. Similarly, I very much I hate this about me. When I hear stand up and I hear people telling stories about like something that happened to them, there's the part of me that's like, I don't think it happened like that, kills it for me a lot of the
Yeah.
time. That's not, I wish it wasn't like that. Most people, it doesn't bother them and they can laugh and that'd be cool. And similarly, I think it's understood that for most storytelling shows, there's an element of hyperbole, and everything you hear might not be true. For better or worse, I can't do that. It's just like that's not how I'm wired. And I should say I found great
I'm
inspiration. There's a poet, Jack Gilbert, who's this amazing poet of the 20th century. His poetry is generally pretty accessible. He's amazing, amazing. I love him. And I once read an interview with him where he talked about how like all his poems are autobiographical. He cannot make up details. And I found that really affirming because it's like I don't think there's no value judgment. I don't think one is better. And undoubtedly, it's actually much more difficult if you can't make things up and it's harder. But that's how I am wired. So I say this insofar as like there are certain like that this story that comes of my show about like this guy who I once met on a bus in New York City who is a low level gangster who I spoke to, and he says to turn we speak for 2 seconds and then he turns around and he's like, I'll tell you what, kid, how about you get off the bus? I'll show you things you ain't never seen. Like sounding truly like a Sopranos character. And I hung out with him a few times. It's just like it's crazy. It didn't end up poorly. Like He was a low level, like heroin dealer, God knows what else, who had recently gotten out of jail. Showed me his gun on the street both times we hung out. And then we were supposed to hang out a third time when I was going to go visit one of his two families for dinner. And then he got arrested and he asked me for bail. And then I was like, I probably shouldn't do that. And
This is
the,
one of those circumstances where going to the third spot probably not the best idea.
yeah, 100%. I mean, it's just crazy. Like, I got off the bus, I leave my luggage in his friend's store and walk around with him. I look back at it and it's like, that's crazy, Noam. But
Oh, that is a wild idea.
I
But
am, yeah,
I
I am
love that.
very lucky that in my 20s, I had a bunch of experiences and interactions with people which could have ended very poorly and they didn't. And I just, so this is all to say, you asked about like, how do you do that? So part of it's like
Yeah,
telling some of these stories where like I sound like a stupid person in my 20s is a way to do that. And, sometimes people actually will say to me after the show, like, it's impressive you're willing to tell things that don't always make you look good. Because I talk about like getting in trouble with stuff as a kid. I never struggle with that. There are certain things I think I would feel a sense of shame of that maybe I wouldn't want to talk about in front of people, but
sure.
it's few and far between, and none of that's in the show. And it's not hard for me to want to be real. I think, I spend a lot of time talking to strangers, both like working on a doctorate in anthropology or working as I do now. I'm a professional, like, uh, audio producer and documentary maker. And so I do interviews with people, or when I street perform on the street and I improvise songs, I ask people for a prompt, but then I talk to them for 30 seconds where I'm drawing out details that I'm going to add to the song, although they don't realize what I'm doing. So I spend a lot of time talking to strangers. And there are people who have different approaches at it. Me and my wife have super different approaches that I think are each effective in their own way. I think we both are generally likable to strangers. She is very empathetic and is like the warmest, kindest person in the world, and you would immediately feel that, and that draws people in. Um, I don't think I'm unempathetic, but I don't think that's the first word people like. That's not my superpower. My
Yeah.
superpower is I am very willing to be very open very quickly if I sense that you sort of are into it, and then like I don't like I hate the phrase too much information. Like I am morally opposed to it. How could that if somebody is comfortable and nobody's uncomfortable, then being real and giving too much information is the most wonderful bonding experience. And it's easy for me to be real. And so I think that's a way in which I sort of access those parts of me and can bring up those parts of me. But I'll also
Yeah.
say one other thing is like when I perform this show, I almost every show have some moment where I am crying as I perform and kind of love it. It's never like so much that it gets in the way. I
Yeah.
actually think it sort of adds to the show, although it's never intentional. It's very, I cry a lot in front of my kids. Like I'm not ashamed to cry. And my grandfather was a crier, and my father was a crier, and music. So my kids all the time we listen to music. My dad shared a lot of music with me, and my grandfather, the curmudgeon, shared a lot of music with me. And so when I share music with my kids, it is such a powerful experience. So if I'm sharing a song that has like deep meaning, or if they're really getting into something, I frequently will tear up and cry. My son loves it. He'll be like, "Are you crying, Dad?" And so that will all inevitably happen at some point in the show. Maybe when I read that letter from my dad, because to me it's so moving how warm he was. Maybe it'll be when I talk about him dying young. Maybe it'll be when I talk about ways in which I try to create a connection with him and my kids. And I think that both artistically is helpful. Again, that's not why I do it. There's never a part of me that is doing it for that reason. But I think it also does this part of I think the audience ultimately respect because like you're very real. I'm not a dude afraid to show his emotions. And even though the show is fundamentally a comedic storytelling show, and most of the story is funny, there's some earnest elements, and it's the first show I've ever done that does anything like that, and that's really fun for me as an artist because that's nothing I've done that with documentaries. So
Sure.
it's on stage. Like I've made documentaries that are very not funny or like so like the last two sort of major films I did was a film, one about like a Jewish violent extremist in the West Bank, called The Radical Jew. Very good film, super depressing and dark. And then I made this film that was broadcast on PBS called A Thousand Pines, which is a documentary about a crew of Mexican tree planting guest workers in the United States. Very good movie, has moments of levity. Is fundamentally not a, it's a serious like movie that often leads people to cry at the end. And so but I never do that on stage, and I rarely do that about stuff which is autobiographical. It's just so much easier for me to access being a clown. That's my
Yeah.
natural thing, and it's harder for me to be earnest, both off stage and on stage. Like it's very hard for me to be in a circle where people are being very like deeply heartfelt. I can do it and I can share. It doesn't interest me so much in a way that maybe with other people it does. It's just not. I don't think there's anything wrong. It's just like that's. I just am much more comfortable. I don't know, something I talk about my shrink. Why do I blanch from earnestness? I don't know. I have ideas, but like so to do a show that has those moments and to get emotional about them is really fun. And it's like it's
Yeah.
not why I did the show, but it's something which has been really special for me. And having now done it at a lot of fringes and audiences really like it, and it's the first show I've done that's gotten like very good 5-star reviews and has won awards, so it resonates with people. Um, and it's just fun to be like, well, here's a new muscle as opposed to be doing autobiographical storytelling at this length, and to be have like try to make a show that has some sincerity to it is new, and it's always fun to do something new, and to be able to do it in a way that seems to resonate with audiences is I have an
Sure.
ego that feels great.
Yeah. Well, and I gotta say, like, the thing that, as we start to wrap up, one of the things that grabbed me while you were talking is a lot of the way I feel about interacting with people. Um, way I always say is like my wife is naturally better at me than basically everything I do. I've done a lot of work and practice to get good at those things. She's a better natural talker. She's much more likable than me. She has a better natural palate than me. Um, but I work a lot at those things. And when you're talking about, oh, I meet somebody, and it's like, oh yeah, I know how to talk to them. You're reading them, right?
Yeah.
Like that read and react, right? That essentially improv of, oh, this is where they're comfortable taking the conversation. I can go in that direction. I
Hmm.
know how they're going to be satisfied by me going in this direction. You can read and run that conversation in the way it goes. That's the way I end up having a lot of conversations with random people is yes, it's a genuine interest. Just, hey, I'm interested in what you have to say.
Yeah.
And being actually interested, being actually thinking about that. I might not feel the emotions then. I think about it later and then I'll feel emotional about it.
Yeah.
Um, or sometimes, media will do that to me. But I love that description of it because it's a certain way of seeing the world,
Yeah.
right? Where there is an analytical nature to it. But I also love how much of your path is that improv work and those things. And to me, that's somebody with a brain that lives like mine, right? Where we can do multiple things at once. Like I'm writing levels, I'm changing things, I'm reading a
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
website while we're talking, while we're having a conversation. But that's a certain kind of brain. Like I can tell we
Yeah.
live in the same world when
A
it
hundred
comes to a lot
percent.
of that stuff.
A hundred
Um,
percent.
but when you're when you've gotten to know yourself as an adult, do you like I don't know, are you happy with where you are right now? And do you think you're living the life that, he would be proud of at this time in your life?
That's a very good question. Those are so to me. Those are two separate things.
Yeah.
Am I living a life he would be proud of? Yes, I think my father would have had a hard time with a lot of life decisions I made. He was not always good at accepting that. I remember like such a fight that left an impression in my mind was I uh, did really well academically as a kid and was applying for like a national merit scholarship, and you had to write an essay. And my dad would often help me write school essays. he didn't. We would write drafts. His editing was maybe a touch more than it should have, but it wasn't so bad. It wasn't so bad. It was mostly like actually pretty good. But I remember this essay and him being like, "Don't write this, whatever." I don't even remember the topic, but I remember he wanted me to write something very different, and I remember thinking like, "I no, that's not what I want to write." And I remember he got very angry at me, being like, "You're not taking it seriously." But I remember thinking, I'm taking it seriously. I just don't think that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
Um, so he wasn't always great at that. And of his four kids, I'm the only one who's not religious, and I definitely have the most untraditional life in a lot of ways. And I think he would have had we would have had one or two conversations. He would have said things he probably shouldn't have. He would have made me feel a little bit bad, and then he would have been the warmest and sweetest. So I think my dad, and it's in contrast to, I love my mother. My mother is a much tougher woman who is much more conservative and not into crossing the line and not performative. And I've been performing in Fringe shows and on stage for over a decade and has never come to any of my performances.
Mm,
Um, which is what it is. But my
of course.
dad would have, and my dad would have, I think about that sometimes. Like my dad would have flown to Scotland because he would have thought that was the coolest thing in the world, and
Yeah.
and my mom would have hated that show if she was there. To be fair, and my dad would have loved the song "Hitler the Vegetarian."
Yeah.
Um, am I happy with life? Oh God, I don't know. I mean,
I,
yes,
I'm
yes,
very
more
much
than
the same.
no. I have a
Yeah.
lot of deep regret over going to grad school, and there's times in life where I was like, I wish at age 26, at age 27, before I started graduate school in anthropology, I did a year in Oxford. I got a master's in Oxford, and the summer before, I was in Boston, and I was crushing it as a performer. I was good at improvising. I was doing it a lot in Faneuil Hall. I was doing a lot at Fenway. It was I'd be in like J.C. Penney and people would recognize me because I was there all the time. And then I went to grad school and stopped performing for many years. And I sometimes I'm like I wish I hadn't done that and I'd just been like I want to perform and see where that takes me. So sometimes I have second guessing, and now I do a lot of performing, and it's a big part of my life. Um, but I enjoy the work I do. I feel super lucky. I'm not working in a coal mine, and I get to make interesting stuff and work on cool documentaries and have a lot of flexibility in my work. Can work anywhere in the world usually, so I get to do a lot of volunteer stuff with kids. So I have a real appreciation for that privilege. But sure, there are times where I'm like, God damn, I wish at age 25 I was like, I just want to be a professional, funny person and see where that goes. So I spend a lot of time trying to stay on stage and perform when I can. And the other thing is now I also have two kids and I love being a dad a
Yeah.
lot. And, I just was away for 10 days performing over 2 weekends at this festival in Fresno, the one where I performed Circumscribed. And when I came back, it was just 10, 11 days, but that felt long. And I'll do that again this summer. I'll go to Edmonton and I'll do Circumscribed and Brother Love. I'll do both those shows. And so this is all to say maybe at some point else in life, I will just spend my time doing that. I am okay with the fact that there's other responsibilities in life that I like, and that's okay. So when you ask, "Am I happy about life?" That's a very long, real way of talking about it. But most days, I wake up happy, and as somebody who has struggled with depression, that feels great.
Hey, that's a win, and I think we can probably both say in very different ways. If I look back at the me that was 25 or 26 and said, "Oh, you should have done this," I'm like, that was a dumb version of me. I'm not that. I'm that person, but a different person who's lived a life. And
100%.
the other thing is, you could also never do the show you're doing now had you not been the dumb person that didn't know himself for real until later. Like,
Yeah.
you can't do this show without that. You can't do that without living a life and making mistakes and getting into weird situations.
Yeah.
Um, so let's go ahead and close out because we can talk forever. So the show is Circumscribed, and this is being held over at the Bloomfield Garfield Activity Center, March 20th, March 21st, 6:35 p.m. Tickets are $15 on pittsburghfringe.org. Noam, any place else you'd like people to follow your work?
Yeah, I will say I have music up on Spotify and Bandcamp and stuff. I am the only person in the world with the name Noam Osband, so I'm super easy to find. And then, yeah, I have a website, noamosband.com. I make there is a breadth of to the things I make, and I take some pride in that. Like I have this show. I just created was the senior producer and head writer on a 6-part podcast about the First Amendment. That's sort of a lighthearted yet very educational take on the First Amendment called Amended: Liberty's Guide to the First Amendment, because the host is a
Nice.
professor named Liberty, which is an amazing first name. And I make documentaries and radio pieces and make different things. And if you go to noamosband.com, you could see them. You could sign up for a mailing list if it tickled your fancy. And yeah, you could find me on just about any social media thing at Noam Osband.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining Just Can't Not. If people are interested in checking out other shows on the Lunch Order Podcast Network in Rochester, we have shows that cross over and you're more universal. Some things are very specifically here, but check them out. Go to lunchdoor.org. We're starting a Rochester's book club in the next few months. So if people are interested in something like that, we're starting one of those. But we really appreciate being part of the Pittsburgh Fringe Festival this year. Hoping to be down for the second weekend. So hopefully you'll see people out there, and we'll see you out on the Fringe.
This has been a presentation of the Lunch Hour Podcast Network.
I love